Can you believe a 17-year-old black kid with no law degree, no courtroom experience, no polished suit, walked into court and made a seasoned lawyer blink, made a judge pause? Picture this: a cold, rigid courtroom, walls lined with old wood and older men. Every face is tight with expectation except one, Franklin Moore's. He's smiling, a smug little curve like he's already won. Judge Reynolds sits up high, arms folded like justice itself is something you have to earn by wearing the right shoes. Suddenly the heavy courtroom doors creaked open, and the whispers hushed. And in walks Jordan Carter. He clutched a worn briefcase in one hand while his other nervously adjusted an oversized blazer that hung awkwardly on his slim frame. His sneakers squeaked softly against the floor as he walked to the defense table. Murmurs rippled through the room, not just of curiosity but of quiet disdain. And the room laughs, not cruelly, just confidently, like a lamb wandered into a lion's den. Except this lamb, he didn't come to get eaten, he came to roar. But first, leave a comment below to let us know where you are watching from, and if you like fascinating stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow we have another incredible story, and there are many surprises waiting for you in the next parts. Judge Reynolds didn't hide his disdain. "This isn't the gymnasium," he said, smirking, scanning the court like it was open mic night. "Are you sure you're not lost on your way to basketball practice?" A few folks chuckled. Moore nearly burst with pride, already savoring his victory. But Jordan didn't flinch. He didn't apologize, didn't stammer. He stood there, shaky but stubborn, and said, "No, Your Honor, I'm here to defend my mother." And just like that, the air changed. The laughter didn't just stop, it choked. People leaned in. Even the judge blinked. The kid didn't have a lawyer. He didn't have a team. All he had was a name, a binder, and a reason. But to understand how that kid ended up there, in that room full of suits and scoffs, you've got to go back. Back to the cracked sidewalks and sagging porches of his neighborhood, the place where ambition lives in broken mailboxes and dreams ride city buses. Jordan lived with his mother, Angela Carter, in a house that had more leaks than lights. Angela scrubbed floors in office buildings where no one remembered her name but still expected her smile. Her hands were calloused, her back always sore, her fingers knew bleach like most folks know pens. But she came home every night, hugged her boy tight and said, "Study hard, baby. Books build bridges where streets are closed." They didn't have much, but they had rhythm. Jordan would come home, drop his backpack and help with dinner while Angela hummed old church tunes and wiped yesterday off the walls. But then one day, rhythm broke. Angela came home after a double shift, her shoes soaked, her hair clinging to her face. She reached into the mailbox and pulled out a letter, folded sharp and mean. She stood there on the porch, reading it once, twice, 3 times, like maybe the words would change if she looked long enough. "They're saying I owe back rent," she whispered, her voice cracking. "But I've paid. I know I've paid." Jordan took the paper, his eyes scanning every line, and the deeper he read, the tighter his fists clenched. She sat down like the air had gone out of her, shaking her head. "You don't understand, Jordan. People like us, we don't win. They'll find a way to take everything, doesn't matter what we do." And in that moment something shifted. The woman who'd spent her life standing tall suddenly looked small. But Jordan, he grew. He didn't cry, he didn't crumble. He stood still and said, "If they're wrong, we're not letting them win, not without a fight." Angela looked up, her eyes tired. "Fight who?" she asked. "You think they'll listen to us? They've got lawyers, Jordan. They've got contracts. What do we have?" Jordan stared back at her. "We've got me." Angela tried to stop him, tried to tell him it was hopeless. "You're just a boy," she said. "You don't even know what you're up against." But Jordan shook his head. "You always told me not to give up. You said education was the way out. Maybe it's the way through, too." She sat there for a moment, hands trembling, eyes brimming with fear and something else. Pride. "If you believe you can," she whispered, "I'll stand behind you." That night, Angela finally slept. But Jordan didn't. He sat at the kitchen table, the same one where she'd taught him to read and write, the same one she'd ironed uniforms on and paid bills beside. He opened his beat-up laptop, dim screen flickering, and typed, "How to fight an eviction." Then, "What is a notary?" Then, "Tenant rights for low-income families." Link after link, statute after statute. He read like the rent was due, because it was. He studied like love was on the line, because it was. He didn't know it then, but somewhere in that sea of dry, complicated legal jargon he'd find it. One sentence, a forgotten footnote, a single truth buried in boring bureaucracy that would shake the whole system. The boy they laughed at was about to give the court a lesson in what justice looks like when it wears sneakers and speaks from the gut, and what he found would make a judge pause and a lawyer panic. While other kids his age were out chasing touchdowns or locked into the latest Xbox marathon, Jordan was knee-deep in legal codes, not because he had to, because he refused not to. Every free minute became a lesson, every borrowed law book a battleground. The kitchen, once filled with the clatter of dishes and the smell of Angela's fried plantains, was now a war room. Pages covered the table like maps. He didn't just read landlord-tenant laws, he consumed them, highlighted them, scribbled questions in the margins like clues in a maze. Each statute was a puzzle piece, each clause a riddle to be solved. To Jordan, law wasn't boring, it was a language, cold, complicated, intimidating, but it had rules, and if it had rules, then it could be learned, and if it could be learned, then maybe, just maybe, it could be beaten. And then he found it. Tucked near the bottom of a housing rights guide, nearly lost in legalese and footnotes, was a phrase that stopped his breath short. All eviction notices must be notarized by an active, state-registered notary public at the time of issuance. Simple, direct, lethal. He grabbed the notice off the wall and examined the signature again. Something about it had always looked rushed, like someone scribbled it in panic rather than protocol. He quickly typed the name into the notary registry, his fingers stiff with tension. No results. He added "retired" to the search, tried again. There it was. The notary had stepped down 2 years before the eviction was ever posted. 2 years. That wasn't a clerical mistake, that was fraud. One name at the bottom of a paper, one name Jordan Carter had just exposed, had turned a legal threat into a paper lie, the kind of lie that loses lawsuits. He ran to Angela, shaking with excitement and disbelief, waving the notice in his hand like it was a winning lottery ticket. But Angela, sitting on the couch with tired eyes and swollen feet, didn't jump to celebrate. She stared at the paper like it might still explode in her hands. "Jordan," she said softly, "we're just renters. You know how these things go. They'll find another way, they always do." But Jordan didn't blink. "Then let's be renters who read the rules," he said. "Let's be the ones who say something when it's wrong. Just this once, let's not be quiet." Angela looked at her son, the boy she had raised to be polite and careful, to stay out of trouble and blend in when it counted, and saw someone else emerging. Not a boy, not quite a man, but something unshakable. She didn't argue, she just nodded and whispered, "Okay, then let's speak." From that moment on, their kitchen didn't just look like a courtroom, it sounded like one. Jordan began rehearsing his arguments in front of a mirror, his hands gesturing the way attorneys do on TV. "Objection! Sustained! Motion to dismiss!" His voice wobbled at first, cracking under the weight of nerves and inexperience. But the more he spoke, the steadier he became. Angela would watch from the doorway, her presence quiet but constant. His voice wasn't just growing louder, it was growing older. Sometimes he'd pause, scribble down a note, cross something out, and start again. He even printed out trial transcripts from similar cases, reading them aloud to mimic the rhythm of legal back and forth. He practiced standing still, holding eye contact, pausing just long enough to let his words sting. He imagined Moore's sneer, Judge Reynolds' raised brow, the gallery's laughter, and responded to every one of them with logic, not emotion. Late one night, Angela stood alone in the tiny hallway, her hand resting on the doorframe while Jordan's voice echoed softly behind her. He was talking to himself again, repeating lines, tightening his phrases like bolts in a steel frame. She closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her, half comfort, half ache, and in a whisper so quiet the walls barely heard it, she said, "God, don't let them crush him." Her voice trembled. "He deserves a world that sees him, not just one that survives him." She didn't ask for a miracle. She just asked for fairness. And maybe a little mercy. The night before the trial, the kitchen looked like the inside of a law library collided with a high school binder aisle. Printouts were stacked by statute. Jordan's handwritten notes had arrows, stars, and underlines everywhere. The eviction notice lay in the center like a dead fish, waiting for autopsy. His oversized blazer, the only formal thing he owned, hung on the back of a chair like a silent promise. Angela brought him a plate of food he wouldn't touch, gently placing it beside him. He smiled at her, said thank you, then returned to the papers. There was no ceremony, no speech, just quiet urgency. Every minute counted. Every sentence he memorized could be the one that saved their home. Angela lingered in the doorway one more time that night, watching her son become something she hadn't seen before, the kind of person who doesn't wait for justice to knock, they go looking for it. He wasn't a lawyer. He didn't even own a tie, but tomorrow he'd walk into a courtroom where people had already decided what kind of boy he was, and tomorrow he'd speak like someone they couldn't ignore. The courtroom didn't wait for him to speak. It judged him the moment he stepped in. Jordan Carter walked through those double doors in a blazer 2 sizes too big, sleeves grazing his knuckles like the fabric was still deciding if he belonged. His sneakers squeaked with every step, betraying nerves he refused to show. The whispers started before he reached the defense table. "Who let the intern in?" someone mumbled. "Where's his lawyer?" Another chuckled. Franklin Moore looked up from his notes with the smugness of a man who already saw the ending. Judge Reynolds glanced at Jordan, lifted an unimpressed eyebrow, and gave him the kind of smile that didn't mean welcome. It meant, watch yourself. Jordan's steps didn't slow. He stood at the table, laid his binder down like it was body armor, and took a breath, not to calm down, but to claim space. When Judge Reynolds finally gave him the floor, Jordan didn't clear his throat or fumble with paper. He didn't apologize for being young or for daring to try. He looked straight ahead, shoulders square, and said, "Your Honor, I'm not here because I want to be. I'm here because no one else showed up." The words didn't land like a punch. They landed like a silence, heavy and full of truth. "I'm not a lawyer. I'm 17. But this eviction wasn't about law. It was about assuming people like us won't fight back. My mother has worked her whole life to keep us afloat, and now she's being evicted on a lie. I'm here to show that lie to this court. I'm here because my mother deserves better than silence." His voice was clear, not loud, steady, not rehearsed. And in that moment, no one dared laugh, because no one wants to admit they're watching someone do what they themselves would never have the courage to try. Franklin Moore stood slowly, every movement deliberate. He didn't look at Jordan like a threat. He looked at him like a fly buzzing too close to the soup. "Thank you, young man," Moore said, voice thick with syrup and sarcasm. "We appreciate your enthusiasm. But I do wonder if your legal training comes from an actual institution or the internet's finest top 10 list of how to win in court." A few soft chuckles broke the stillness. Jordan didn't respond. Moore continued, "Because surely you must realize that citing statutes without understanding precedent is like swinging a bat in the dark. You'll hit something, but it won't be justice." He turned back toward the judge, confident his jab had landed. But Jordan stepped forward, calm, measured, and said, "I didn't learn this in law school. I learned it in fear. Fear of losing the only home I've ever known. Fear of watching my mother get crushed by a system built to ignore her." He paused. "Give me 5 minutes, Mr. Moore. I'll teach you something your law degree skipped. How to fight when you've got nothing left to lose." Jordan opened his binder. No dramatics, just the sound of a page turning. He lifted the eviction notice, held it up so the judge could see the signature. This notice, he said, was delivered with urgency, threats, deadlines, but no one asked if it was legal. He stepped closer to the bench. At the bottom is a notary's name, Martha Allen. A public records search shows that Ms. Allen retired as a notary 2 years before this document was signed. Gasps whispered across the room like wind through dry leaves. Moore's lips tightened, but he said nothing. Jordan wasn't finished. According to Section 58 of the State Tenant Protection Act, any eviction notice must be notarized by an active, certified notary at the time of issuance. If not, the notice is invalid. He pointed directly at the date. This isn't just a clerical error. This is a forged thunder on fake paper. Someone hoped no one would check. Someone was wrong. Judge Reynolds leaned forward slightly, no longer smirking. Moore shifted in his chair. The gallery was silent. No whispers, no mutters, no scoffs. Just eyes locked on a boy who wasn't supposed to know what he knew. Jordan placed the notice on the judge's bench and stepped back. He didn't bow, didn't nod. He just stood there, still, waiting. The kind of stillness that comes not from fear, but from conviction. The kind that makes people uncomfortable because it holds no apology. Judge Reynolds cleared his throat. "This is a serious claim," he said, his tone clipped, but no longer dismissive. "Given the nature of the accusation, the court will recess briefly to verify this documentation." He gave Jordan a long look before rising from the bench. The gavel cracked once, sharp and final. People stood, murmuring again now that the moment had passed. Jordan turned, grabbed his binder, and walked past Franklin Moore without looking down. But just as he passed, he leaned in and whispered, "Still think I found this on YouTube?" Moore didn't answer. He just clenched his jaw and stared ahead. Because sometimes the most dangerous voice in the room isn't the loudest. It's the one no one saw coming. The hallway outside the courtroom buzzed with hushed speculation, but all Jordan could hear was his own heartbeat. He sat on a wooden bench, elbows on his knees, binder in his lap, staring at nothing. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of almost getting it right. Angela sat beside him, still in her work shoes, her hand reaching for his and giving it a squeeze. "You're already my verdict," she said gently. Jordan turned to her, eyes searching hers for something more than comfort. "But what if it's not enough?" he asked, voice quiet but heavy. "What if they still don't see it?" Angela didn't hesitate. "You were enough," she said, "the minute you stood up." He leaned his head back against the wall and let himself remember how this all began. Not the eviction, not the court date, but the moment that turned the tide. It was almost midnight. Angela had fallen asleep with the television on, the flicker of late-night commercials casting soft light over the room. Jordan sat at the kitchen table, a half-empty cup of instant coffee beside him. Surrounded by documents that felt older than time, his eyes burned, his head ached, but he kept scrolling. There was something off about that notary stamp, something too perfect, too polished, like a costume trying too hard to be convincing. So he dug. He found a list of certified notaries updated by the state monthly. No Martha Allen, not for the last 2 years. He double-checked, then triple-checked. Her name was on a retirement document filed in the clerk's office, dated long before the eviction notice was ever printed. Jordan stared at the screen in disbelief. "All I wanted was a fair shot," he muttered to himself. "I found the receipts instead." When the judge returned, the gallery fell back into silence. Judge Reynolds's robe fluttered slightly as he approached the bench, his expression carved from stone. He didn't glance at Jordan, didn't look at Moore, just settled into his seat and tapped the gavel once. "The court has reviewed the documents presented by the defense," he began, his tone even, unreadable. "According to official state records, the notary whose name appears on the eviction notice retired from legal service 2 years prior to the date on the document." A collective gasp moved through the gallery like a ripple through still water. Even the court clerk looked up, blinking in surprise. Jordan's fingers tightened around the edge of his binder. Franklin Moore, usually composed, flinched, just slightly. But enough. The judge paused, eyes sweeping the room before adding, "This finding casts substantial doubt on the legal standing of the eviction." Moore stood before the silence could settle. "Your Honor," he began, his voice trying to regain the confident pitch it had lost, "even if the notarization was mishandled, which I'm not conceding, the tenant in question failed to meet her financial obligations. That fact remains unchanged. This is a distraction, not a defense." He let the words hang like they were some kind of lifeboat. But Jordan stood too, calm, poised, and ready. "Your Honor," he said, "state precedent in Franklin v. Rhodes 2011 clearly states that procedural errors, including false notarization, render eviction notices void, regardless of financial status. The law doesn't say mostly valid or close enough. It says valid, legal, and certified. This notice doesn't meet that standard. Period." A few heads nodded in the crowd. Someone whispered, "He's got him." Moore tightened his lips, flipping through his folder like the right comeback might be hiding between the pages. Judge Reynolds leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Jordan's. The room tensed, unsure what would come next. "Mr. Carter," the judge said, voice a little lower now, like he was no longer speaking down to someone but rather across. "Where did you learn all this?" Jordan met his gaze. "From trying not to lose my home," he replied. "From watching my mother cry over a piece of paper that didn't make sense. And from learning that just because something's written doesn't mean it's right." The judge nodded slowly, a breath catching in his chest as if the weight of it all finally settled. "You're doing better than some who pass the bar," he said, voice tinged with reluctant admiration. "This court's listening. Now, make it matter." The gavel didn't fall. Not yet. But something else did. The doubt in the room, the assumption, the quiet belief that Jordan didn't belong here. It all cracked, and what rose in its place wasn't just respect. It was something sharper. The kind of attention reserved for someone who just stopped a system mid-step and made it look easy. Franklin Moore wasn't finished, not by a long shot. The courtroom smelled of tension and old wood as he stood again, his voice now sharper, faster, slicing through the silence like paper cuts. He launched into rapid-fire legalese, citing obscure subsections, misquoting statutes just enough to twist them. It was classic misdirection. Overwhelm the young opponent, throw ink in the water, hope he panics. Section 12b, paragraph 3, Moore barked, states that even in the absence of proper notarization, but Jordan cut in, voice calm, words crisp, only if the tenant was previously served a valid notice under Clause 4A, which we've already proven didn't happen. Moore narrowed his eyes, tried again. "But intent matters here. So does execution," Jordan replied, not missing a beat. "You can't file poison and call it medicine just because you meant well," Moore faltered. The crowd noticed. Jordan held his binder steady in both hands. "I'm not here for style," he said, voice low but firm. "I'm here for truth." The shift in the room wasn't loud, but it was undeniable. You could feel it more than hear it. A cough held in, a nod given, the kind of quiet people make when they're no longer watching, they're believing. An older white woman sitting in the third row, her scarf bunched around her neck like armor, leaned toward the man beside her and whispered, "That boy's got more justice in him than most judges I've seen." No one laughed this time. A younger man in a hoodie muttered, "He's good, real good." Even the court clerk, who had kept her face unreadable for most of the hearing, paused to glance at Jordan with something close to respect. The sound had changed. No more dismissive murmurs, just the rustle of minds recalibrating what they thought they knew. Judge Reynolds sat back in his chair, arms folded tight across his chest, but his mind was moving. His gaze wasn't fixed on Jordan anymore. It had drifted somewhere far off. He remembered a case from 10 years earlier, a tenant with a stack of unpaid rent slips and 3 kids evicted within days of Christmas. Everything had been done by the book, every signature, every date, airtight. The woman cried while her children shivered beside her. He remembered stamping that order, hearing his own gavel echo as she collapsed into her coat. Legal, yes. Just? He wasn't so sure. That day had haunted him in the quiet hours when the robe was off and the courtroom lights were down. Law without heart, he thought now, was like a compass in a dead man's hand. It points, but it never saves. The silence in the courtroom stretched, full of weight and waiting. Judge Reynolds leaned forward slowly, resting his elbows on the bench. He looked at the eviction notice again, at the binder Jordan had compiled, at Moore, who now seemed smaller than his tailored suit. The gavel hovered in his hand, then fell, once. "This court rules in favor of the defendant, Angela Carter," he said, voice clear and final. "The eviction notice is invalid. The landlord is ordered to cease all proceedings and is liable for damages due to wrongful eviction and emotional distress." Angela gasped, a sound like breath finally returning after weeks underwater. She pressed her hands to her mouth, tears rushing forward. Franklin Moore's shoulders sagged. He lowered his head, lips tightening around whatever excuse he no longer had the stomach to say. Jordan didn't move. Not yet. He let it settle, let it mean something. After a moment, Judge Reynolds stood, not the commanding rise of a man closing a case, but the slower step of someone reconsidering everything. He descended from the bench, his footsteps steady, until he stood before Jordan Carter. The room was still, listening with a kind of attention reserved for moments that would be remembered. "Mr. Carter," the judge said quietly, "I owe you more than a ruling. I owe you an apology." Jordan blinked. He didn't expect that. "When you first walked into this courtroom," the judge continued, "I saw a kid, and that was my mistake. But today you reminded me why this robe matters, and why truth should never depend on who's delivering it." He extended his hand. Jordan took it, firm and steady. "If you ever decide to study law," the judge added, his voice softer, "I would be honored to mentor you. The system needs people like you, people who speak truth not for applause, but for justice." Jordan looked him in the eye and nodded once. "Justice needs better hands," he said, "and I've got two." The judge smiled faintly. Not performative, ill, just real. And in that moment, no one questioned whether Jordan Carter belonged in that courtroom. Because truth, it turns out, wears sneakers, and it stands tall. The courthouse doors closed behind them with a soft thud, but the weight they'd carried for weeks didn't follow them out. Sunlight poured across the steps, warming the faces of Jordan and Angela Carter as they stood there in silence, letting it all sink in. No more documents, no more last-minute research, no more wondering if the truth would be enough. Just the sky above them and the street below. Jordan looked back at the building one last time, eyes steady, jaw set with quiet promise. "One day," he said barely above a whisper, "I'll come back here, but not as a defendant." Angela turned to him, eyes misting again. "As a lawyer?" she asked. He nodded once, the corners of his mouth curling upward, not in pride, but in clarity. "Yeah, as someone who makes the system listen." They walked home with the same worn shoes, past the same cracked sidewalks and boarded-up windows, but everything felt different. The world looked familiar, yet strangely new, as if something had been reset, like even the streetlights stood a little straighter. Jordan's binder was tucked under his arm, the pages worn but no longer heavy. Angela walked beside him in quiet rhythm, her usual shuffle softened by relief. "All these years I thought I had to carry everything alone," she said gently. "Turns out, you were watching. You were learning." Jordan looked over, still carrying that weightless calm. "You never let me forget who I was," he said. "I just needed a reason to remember who I could be." She smiled, the lines on her face deep but softened. "Your fight gave me peace," she said. "And peace? I haven't felt that in a long time." By the time they reached their neighborhood, word had already started to spread. A short clip had leaked from the courtroom. Jordan, standing at the defense table, voice steady, binder in hand, delivering his closing point with a clarity that could split granite. It didn't take long for the video to catch fire online. 17-year-old defends his mother in court and wins. Headlines grew legs, comments flooded in. Neighbors who'd barely made eye contact before now leaned over their porches. "That's the boy," one of them whispered. "The one who took on the system." An older man in a lawn chair gave Jordan a nod usually reserved for military salutes. "You made us proud, son," he said, tipping his cap. Even the corner store clerk, who rarely spoke more than 10 words, handed Angela a bag of bread and said, "It's on the house today, for the warrior and her boy." But Jordan wasn't done. The victory was real, but it wasn't the finish line. It was the blueprint. Days later, the kitchen table once again became his battlefield. But this time, he wasn't fighting for survival. He was fighting for a future. College brochures replaced legal statutes. Application essays took the place of court arguments. He stayed up late researching pre-law programs, scholarships, community support networks, and every night before he shut his laptop, he stared at a sticky note taped to the wall. It read, "Justice doesn't wait for permission." He kept studying, still surrounded by the hum of a fridge too old and the creak of chairs too tired, but now everything had a direction. The world tried to shrink him, people would say, but the law became his armor. Jordan wasn't just preparing to be a lawyer. He was preparing to be a voice, the kind that doesn't echo, but lingers. To everyone watching this story, to everyone who stayed until the end, remember this. You don't need a title to seek justice. You don't need a law degree or a bench to sit behind. Sometimes all you need is the courage to say, "Enough." Jordan Carter didn't walk into that courtroom with credentials. He walked in with conviction, and that made the difference. Maybe your courtroom is different. Maybe it's your job, your neighborhood, your child's school, or your own kitchen table, wherever it is. Stand. Speak. Learn what they think you won't understand, and when they underestimate you, let them. That's the best part of the story. Let them laugh. Then make them listen. Because kindness isn't always soft. Sometimes it comes wrapped in courage. Sometimes it wears a wrinkled blazer and walks into court alone. And sometimes it wins. If Jordan's journey moves you, share it. If it reminded you of your own strength, subscribe. Because the next story might not be his. It might be yours.